or anything of that regard. Because you ultimately, you can't do anything about it.
And I think another thing, when your question was how do you get a reader to go along with, to kind of understand what's happening here, it's because it's about creating characters. You may not know what it's like to be in a revolution, but you will know what it's like to be afraid and to want to protect the people that you love. So it's not connecting them based on action, but it's connecting them based on these emotions that we can all feel. And if you can get that with your character, Hailu, you may not understand what he's thinking as a doctor with this girl, but as a father, you might be able to understand a father's need to protect someone younger than him. And so if I can convey that in the novel, I can get readers to follow along with that.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. Part of it is determining what is most important for me, the crafter of the thing, the poet, the author. Because what's important is not the situation, the social situation of, for example, gang violence. Right? There's violence everywhere in the world. What's important is my relationship to violence, period, and how I feel. Why am I invested in addressing violence? And it's my story that's going to communicate best to a reader. It's my investment that's going to communicate best. It's my ability to put my own emotional potency in the text that's going to be the thing that attracts a reader. So I think we often get distracted, particularly in poetry, with the context and overlook the heart of the matter, which is always a human element, rather than a political element. Oh, sorry.
Last two questions. Well,
I really enjoyed the answers that you all gave to the last question. I read a line from a poem by Pablo Neruda, the Chilean nationalist poet. It said, "Between lips and teeth, something goes dying like a bird." But the question I want to ask is, I hear in your George, your explanation about the human element, and so a democracy, a very democratic attitude to the writing of poetry. I have come across so many occasions where I figure everybody writes poetry. I mean, everybody writes poetry, it seems to me. However, not everybody is allowed to carry that forward or feel good about it. And I want you to speak to that.
Who's allowed? Who's doing the prohibiting?
I think for a lot of people, the prohibiting is how will people take this when I put it out? That's the first thing. So it's a perceived rejection before.
Okay.
But it is also the actual rejections that come in people's statements about the work. Why I say that? We have I teach a course in fundamentals of written English, which has nothing to do with poetry per se, but we allow the students in the journaling that they do to include a couple of and invariably students write poetry. And I remember once a student wrote, "I want to have a house, a green house, a red house, a blue house." And I thought, this is so good, but it will not go anywhere.
Where is it supposed to go? and in fact, that's not true, because it did go somewhere. And in fact, now it's here.
And it's living here because I say it to you. She won't get it. I believe, and we poetry is inter-individual.
Yeah.
It can't only stay inside of your yard. And it is when it is given an opportunity to
Well, not everybody wants to share their poetry, right? Well, there are a number of. So to the first point, there's a preconceived, and this is what all poets, every writer deals with, is, you know, if I'm doing anything that's worthwhile, then I'm going to be nervous about its reception. The only if I'm writing what I think everyone's going to agree with and appreciate, and then it's safe. Then who wants that? Right now, I'm not writing for myself. I'm writing for somebody else. The act of writing a poem is already a provocative act, right? There's already pushback, right? I'm doing something that is not approved by the culture. So I should expect that there's going to, as a writing and publishing poet, first of all, rejection is the majority of the job. You have to just know that that's the case. And part of the journey that is so thrilling for me as a poet is overcoming the shame and fear that I've created. When I do that, it doesn't matter. I mean, there's always going to be a critic. There's always going to be someone who says, well, I didn't like this line, or I didn't like this image, or I don't like you. There's always going to be, anytime you put yourself, anytime you risk yourself for the sake of communication, for the sake of reaching out to others, you're risking rejection. That's what makes it worthwhile, right? You're also risking connection. So I think I hear your concern for your students. I would like to hear from them that concern, right? So I think part of the culture of rejection that we create is telling people that is creating an environment where we should expect to feel self-conscious and afraid of expressing ourselves. So, yeah.
All right, we have one more question, one last question.
Mine was like a follow-on from what you ended with, Gregory, there about politics and poetry, and it applies equally to Mazas. At one of the panels that in the Biblit Fest that just finished before you guys got here, unfortunately, one of the young poets at the session I was speaking at asked whether we thought that it would be a good thing, this was in terms of sexual difference, you know, non-heteronormative literary expression, to have a kind of, to deliberately write as a, whatever the A may be, as a black person, as a feminist, as a lesbian, whatever. Because it needed saying that such people exist and have, you know, something to say. And I just wonder, when you were talking about balance, you had a political position about it. And you did express that political position through your poetry. But how do you draw the line between that kind of propaganda,
Right.
you know,
Right.
and poetry, or the same with you, man? I mean, what you're obviously, it's horribly chilling just from that little bit that you read, what people are capable of doing to each other, and what kindness might actually look like in that situation. But ultimately, it is a criticism. Or we must feel, in a way, very critical of the situation that was allowed to develop in that way, and what it did to people and to families. So how do you just bring back that righteous anger?
Well, I'm not advising bringing back the righteous anger. I'm advising finding where the righteous anger is located and writing out of that, as opposed to, because I think we often get these prepackaged kind of political positions and we speak, we kind of ventriloquize out of those positions as opposed to finding what is my stake, what is my investment in, my emotional investment, my human investment in this issue. You know, so I don't think it's worthwhile to simply write as a black person because it doesn't produce anything. It is worthwhile, and this is me speaking, right, opinion-wise, it is worthwhile to speak as a person who often feels alienated. That's a human condition. Right? I think that's the thing that's most worthwhile and what turns it into art. And it's doing the double duty, right?
I think, well, maybe I'll speak in more general terms and then speak specifically to my novel, but I think that if a writer is writing against something, if writing becomes an act of resistance against something, it falls into very real danger of being didactic. And then what do you have left to write about when that entity is gone, right? You can't use this kind of resistance as a foundation for a vocabulary. It has to come from something much bigger than that thing that that we're pointing a pen at. In my novel, the first thing I had to tell myself was this was not going to be a political novel. This was not going to be a novel about politics. This was going to be a novel about a family with very different views within that group, trying to survive in the ways that they know how. What happened to Hailu and this with this young girl gives you one perspective of what happens. So in this particular scene, the soldiers are the bad guys. The regime is the bad guy. But I deliberately also wrote from the perspective of a torturer. And I deliberately chose to include the perspective of a soldier in the book. Part of it is, as much as we have to put our characters at risk, I think as writers, we have to put ourselves at risk when we're writing. It can't be a safe story for us too. And so I had to constantly push myself in ways that felt very uncomfortable to me. But if I'm trying to be as honest to the story, to encompass a period, an era, then I have to move beyond my own skin and walk in the steps of someone else I may not completely like. But between what Hailu does and what a soldier does, or what this torturer does, if lives are ended at the end of a scene, who's worse? And I think those were the questions that I was asking, and not necessarily about politics at all.
Well, thank you, Greg and Naza, for your readings and your responses to those questions. Thank you for your questions, and thank you for coming out tonight. We have copies of Callaloo here on the table for you to peruse as you leave. But thank you for joining us, and participants, we'll look forward to continue to work with you this week. All right, good night.
Samantha.